So, we had our first break. Perhaps I could simply say that lunch and dinner will be served directly opposite the room where we just had our coffee. And there's a little sign there on the other side of the this what do you call it? Atrium is not quite right. No? And the menu is already posted. It's a buffet service. You simply help yourself at the side. And lunch will be at 1 o'clock and dinner will be at 8 o'clock today and tomorrow. So now we come to the second part of this this dialogue liturgy. And Roman Hankeln will start off with a presentation, and we have Niels Holger Petersen as respondent, and then we shall throw the discussion open to all participants here. Roman I associate with all my own early experiences getting to know the Historia repertory. Because he was involved, I mentioned it yesterday, he was the right-hand man in our research project in Regensburg. Some of the results of that project can be seen online, the melodic database, for example, but there is a great deal more which in those days we couldn't put online. The data was simply too large. We wanted to put all our transcriptions as PDF files online, but there was too much. We're talking about the late 90s now, the 1990s. Nowadays it would be very easy, but perhaps we shall come back to that. It was a good time. I was on one floor near the other rooms of the Institut für Musikwissenschaft. But when the grant came through, we had to find a workroom for Roman, and he had to go down one floor and round several corners, and we referred to his workroom as Nibelheim, and I was upstairs in Valhalla, because the giving directions and leaving all the work to the Nibelungs down below. So he was Alberich and I was Wotan. And of course the Nibelungs were the real the workmen of this project. Good. But since then he's moved on. We lost him to Weimar and Jena first of all, where he completed a habilitation on the leader of the Weimar Classic, so he's an expert philologist as well as musicologist. And then he moved up to Trondheim, where he's still working. The rest of his accomplishments you can read also, a few of them in the curriculum vitae. I won't delay this presentation any longer. Roman. Oh, I should just say I forgot to show this earlier on. The frontispiece from Ben Brand's edition of the Chants for St. Regulus of Lucca. There's poor old Regulus going to a sticky end. But I'll turn this off now. We'll concentrate on it.
I hope that this will not happen with me. Somebody has thought, or... thank you, David, for this kind introduction. I come with a phenomenon now. In the paper, which was circulated, I intended to describe two different aspects of text-music interaction. And consequently, I had to write not one but two separate studies. In the first study, I talk about text setting not from a melodic standpoint, but focusing on the number of notes and their connection to the syllables of the words. In the second study, I talk about how the topic of joy is reflected in the formal and melodic setting of the chants. At the end, I add a short reflection about the advantages and disadvantages of the methods employed in these two studies. In fact, it is thought a little bit like yin and yang, or Goethe's Prometheus and Ganymede, reflecting two opposite extremes of our methodological approach at the moment. Therefore, those studies might support each other or might not, you will see, and I'm very much interested in a methodological discussion afterwards. But I think there is no need to summarize the results of the second study. The first, however, is more experimental and, as you might agree upon, and might be better understood with the help of some introductory remarks. First of all, the first study should be seen as a continuation of my earlier attempts to describe the stylistic behavior of science offices. Several papers of our meeting refer to these studies, and I think therefore it might be appropriate and more economic from my side to say some words about this methodological approach from my point of view. It's the paper of Danette Brink and the first paper of our afternoon session. They talk about parts of this approach. Well, from 1996 to 1999, during the great research project at Regensburg David mentioned, we described about 100 saints' offices from all periods of the Middle Ages. It was the goal of this project to describe the stylistic stratification of these charts. It was David's idea to approach this problem by establishing criteria which describe non-Gregorian stylistic symptoms. Applying these criteria should help to distinguish the traditional Gregorian chants from the non-traditional repertory. But what is traditional and what not? Here, I simply used my own intuitive experience and determined that the traditional style is characterized by predominant stepwise melodic motion, which moves in arches, punctuated by a tendency for stagnation, for example, immediate note repetition. Ambitus does usually not exceed a fifth. Characteristic on the larger formal level is the absence of literal repetitions. This includes some reluctance to use the same notes for phrase endings. Can you understand what I'm talking about here? Against this background, I developed a set of stylistic markers. All these stylistic markers show symptoms which leave the stylistic boundaries of the traditional repertory. Among these stylistic markers are scales and leaves larger than a fourth, neat combinations, and subtonal cadences. Only Bezuidenhout describes them in more detail in his paper. There is no need to repeat that here. I call these stylistic markers Melodiemarken. The English equivalent might be melody markers. Biologists talk about biological markers. A biological marker is a measurable indicator of some biological state or condition, so Wikipedia tells us. The melody markers have the same character. They are designed in principle as measurable indicators of a certain condition of the chant. I would not to imply that our later chants have a bad condition, but they have another condition than those from the traditional repertory. Or, with other words, the purpose of melody markers was to measure the stylistic distance of a piece from those written in the traditional style. The concept of melody markers was not designed as a closed system. In my first studies, I worked with leaves, scales, lead combinations, and subtonal cadences only. Later, I proposed other markers, as for example the zigzag movement, or, additional markers can and should be added, in fact. The melody markers were from the beginning designed as elements of a larger approach, which should describe the chants as a whole. The melody markers were combined with the so-called Umgebungsmarken or context markers. These context markers recorded the ambitus of a given chant, its length, the amount of melismatic setting. Later, I recorded also whether the ambitus spanned an octave and reached the octave above the final in the authentic modes or the upper fifth in the playable modes. If that was the case, I said, the chant had octave valence. In English, I would formulate the chant has octave valency or an octave grid. When asking after the octave grid, I simply took an analytical perspective into account which David Heine had formulated at this time. And we will hear more about this perspective later today in his paper. When talking about melody markers, it is important not to treat them in isolation, but to see them against the background of the context markers, especially the length of the chant. A single leap combination in a chant with 200 notes seems, for example, pretty insignificant to me. The same leap combination in a short antiphon of, let's say, 20 notes only has quite another impact. Many leaps and/or longer scales in a short chant leave a quite ungregorian impression. In my perspective, each chant represents a stylistic profile, which consists of the elements just mentioned, both the melody markers and the context markers. This profile can be compared to that of other chants, and with the help of averages and percentages can we describe profiles of whole series of chants and compare them to other series. In 2009, I published a summary of my work on 85 antiphon repertories, a little over 1,800 antiphons, in the Festschrift for Marino and Colette. In this article, I presented these 85 antiphon repertories in a list. And please take a look at your handout now, which is based on this list. If we look at the first table, the list included the following aspects: the feast, the date, the text form, T, the presence of melody markers, MM, the presence of an octave grid, octave valence, AV, the ambitus, AM, length, LG, and melismatic setting, ML. In the columns MM, AV, AM, LG, and ML, you find Roman and Arabic numerals. Please focus not only on the Roman numerals. The Roman numerals inform about whether the given criterion is present in a lesser or higher degree in these repertories. I use a scale of 5 Roman numerals. Number 1 indicates that the criterion is absent or only present to a low degree. Number 5 indicates that the criterion is present to a very high degree. To give you an example, take a look at page 4 of your handout, section E. The antiphon series number 80 in honor of Carolus Magnus. So it was on this slide here. In column MM, you find the Roman numeral 4, which means this repertory shows a high amount of melody markers. In column AD, you find also a 4. Nearly all of the chants have the octave grid. In column AM, you find the number 3. The ambitus of the chant main antiphons is usually not bigger than an octave. The Roman numeral 1 in the columns LG and ML shows that these antiphons are usually short and syllabic. If you like, please take a look at the various combinations of these aspects in the lists later. In the Colette Festschrift, the list was ordered according to a prospectus of all of these criteria. But let us here and now just focus on the melody markers and the octave valence columns MN and AV in the lists. We start on page 1 of the handout. Section A. The list starts with the traditional widely transmitted antiphon repertories from the Corpus Antiphonalum Officii. If you look into date, you see CIO all the time, until we come to Gallus. They show absence, these repertories, and they show absence or very limited presence of melody markers, as well as no values of octave valence. As you see, you just see the Roman numerals 1 and 2. In section B on page 2 of your handout, we find the same low values for melody markers. But now the repertories are nearly all members of group 3 of octave valence. I think this is a particularly interesting group for the questions you are talking about, because you will find here some really early offices or antiphon repertories which participate to a larger degree extent in the octave grid. For example, Stephanus, Hammer, Vincenzo, you mentioned him, I think, Fuscianus and Vincentius, they have 48%. Section C, page 3. You see, this is a particular large group. Look at column M. Still, we encounter only numbers 1 and 2 in this column. Melody markers do not reach prominent values, but column AB shows that all repertories are members of the high octave valence groups 4 or 5, which means that practically all charts have the octave grid. Now to sections D and E on page 4 of your handout. Here are all repertories members of the melody marker groups 3 to 5. All are members of the high octave valence groups 4 and 5. The list shows what we can do with the melody markers. We can describe the placement of a given repertory of antiphons in comparison to other repertories. But we cannot use the melody markers in isolation. Now some words about the question of style and dating. For me, the list confirmed my approach. The oldest repertories before 1000, you can see them in section A on page 1 if you want. We started with that. The oldest repertories before 1000, they do indeed not participate in the higher melody marker groups. But much more important was another observation. Please look again at page 4, sections E in your handout. Here you'll find the antiphon repertories with the highest amount of melody markers, group 5. These are the famous offices written by Hermannus Contractus in honor of Wolfgang and Rafa, and those written by Urdaskalk in honor of Conradus and Udalricus. They come from the 11th and 12th century. Please focus now on section C on page 3. Here you find a very large group, I said that already, a very large group of later and famous offices from the 12th century onwards up to the 15th century. These offices are all members of the octave valence groups 4 and 5. All these offices thus participate in modern style tonality after the millennium. But they show by no means the pronounced interest in the melody markers we have seen in the offices from group E, which nearly all come from the 11th and 12th centuries. In my Festschrift article I wrote, therefore, von einer linearen historisch-stilistischen Evolution ist bei den hier analysierten Antiphonenbeständen keine Rede. We cannot speak about a linear historical stylistical evolution in the antiphon repertories which were analyzed here. With other words, we observe a general lack of interest in the melody markers from the 13th century onwards. At the end of the Middle Ages, office composition becomes melodically more conservative. And a paradigmatic example is, for example, the Recollectio office of Levi, which is very conservative. But let me return now to the present context. The melody markers describe the chants almost as if they were absolute music. In 1996, this was a deliberate choice. I simply started with an analytical area which looked a bit easier to cope with and postponed nearly all textual aspects. To analyze the relationship of music and text seems much more difficult. Here one has to describe not one medium, but the interaction of two media. I hesitated a long time before I thought I had found an appropriate approach. The first part of my present contribution gives you an idea how this approach might look like. But before we come to this new approach, please take another look at the tables on your handout, section C on page 3. This is, as mentioned, a fairly large group of offices, most of them with rhymed texts. It is rather difficult to describe stylistic differences in this large group with the help of octave valence and/or melody markers alone. Stylistically, they all look pretty much the same. I see, therefore, my latest study of text-music interaction as an analytical possibility to differentiate, especially Group C, a bit more. Indeed, I think this may work, since I came across interesting differences of text setting in the offices in honor of Franciscus and Elizabeth, which, seen from the musical perspective only, look very much alike. Now, finally, some words about the first part of my present study. In this text, I analyzed the text setting of 6 antiphon repertories, that of Sebastianus from the traditional repertory, Stephanus of Hungary, Lutgerus, Carolus, all from the 12th century, and Elizabeth and Franciscus from the 13th century. I focused on 2 perspectives, A, the placement of melismas, and B, the choice of so-called texture patterns. With the term texture pattern, I described the distribution of notes on the syllables of a word. Due to statistical reason, I focused only on 2 to 4 syllable words and only on 2 to 4 note melismas. Longer words, or melismas, are too uncommon for this statistical approach. My study starts with describing on which syllables melismas were placed in these 5 antiphon repertories. Most repertories showed similarities in that respect. Please take a look at page 5 of your handout. It shows the patterns of melismatic placement in the offices for Stephanus, Carolus, Elizabeth, and Franciscus. We start with the first table, that of Stephanus. Let us focus on the column category. The column shows 4 categories, A1, B1, C1, and C2. Category A1 means that most 2 to 4 note melismas are placed on the accent in 2 and 3 syllable paroxytona. Category B1 means that most 2 to 4 note melismas are still placed on the accent, but this time in 4 syllable paroxytona. A little bit longer words, they have therefore another structure. Categories C1 and C2 describe the placement of melismas for 3 and 4 syllable pro-paroxytona. Here we meet the interesting phenomenon that most melismas are not placed on the accent but on the following syllable Y. If we compare all these categories with each other in this table, we realize that the amount of melismas decreases at the end of the words towards the final syllables Y or Z. But let us now compare all the tables on page 5 of your handout. with each other. The first three, Stephanus, Carolus, and Elizabeth, share the same categories: A1, B1, C1, C2. All three of them share these categories. But at the end, the Francisco's table shows quite different categories: A2, A3, B3, and C3. These differences are due to the fact that the Francisco's antiphons have a tendency to place melismos not on the accent, but more often on the syllable before or after the accent. In the second part of my first study, I did not longer talk about melismos, but about the mentioned texture patterns. These texture patterns describe on which syllables most notes are placed: on the accent of a word, A; on the syllable before the accent, B; on the syllable following the accent, F; or on the syllables surrounding the accent, S. In addition comes the texture pattern E. Here all syllables receive the same number of notes, which means very often that they receive just one note. Using these categories, it was possible to describe the predilections of the various offices in form of profiles. I'll show you an excerpt of these comparisons on page 6 of your handout. We start with table 18. It shows the texture profile for the old antiphons in honor of San Sebastianus. You see that the category E is on top level in nearly all word categories. Category E means, I repeat, syllables receive the same amount of notes. In this case, the old traditional antiphons are mainly set syllabically, and this strictly. But an exception occurs. Among the long 4pp words, we find other categories on top level, A and B. What does that mean? That means that longer words attract kind of ornamentation. They are not set naked, so to speak, only syllabical. Let us proceed to table 19. It shows the T-pattern profile for the Stephanus Rex antiphons. Here the A category receives top values in all word categories. This means that most notes are often placed on the accented syllables in these antiphons. So far, the tables for Sebastianus and Stephanus show rather clear predilections for their texture patterns. But let us proceed to the following table, number 22. It shows the profile for the Elizabeth antiphons, Gaudia and Gaudia. Here we observe no clear predilections. Several categories climb on higher levels. The E category reaches higher values in the two-syllable words. In the 3p words, the A category reaches higher values, and so on. The last table, number 23, shows the texture profile for the Francisco's antiphons. We observe here a distinct tendency to use the B category, especially in the 3p, 4p, and 4pp words. This means the Francisco's antiphons show a preference to place more notes on the syllable before the accent. This corresponds to the tendency of the Francisco's antiphons to place melismas on these syllables. I mentioned that earlier. These tables show thus the various individual attitudes towards text setting which are at work in these repertories. Some attitudes are more distinct, Sebastianus, Stephanus, Franciscus. Other attitudes are less distinct, Elizabeth. The old Sebastianus antiphons are syllabically set. The 12th century Stephanus charts use a pneumatic setting which favors the accent. The setting of the Elizabeth antiphons is indifferent, whereas the Franciscus antiphons seem to favor the B category. Especially remarkable seems to me the difference between the text setting of the Elizabeth and the Franciscus repertory, since on first sight, from the melodical standpoint, these two offices from the 13th century seem to have a lot in common. If we compare their attitudes towards text setting, differences are clear, however. Let me summarize finally the results of the first study. It showed that generalizations about the relationship between accent and melismatic setting are not appropriate. Words with different accent structure are set differently. Alternating accentual poetic schemes, dum bum 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 and so on, alternating accentual poetic schemes did not lead to any particular reflection in the texture. The same is true for a verse feet orientated setting in the hexameter texts of Carolus and Stephanus. With increasing length of a word decreases the probability that it is set completely syllabically. We have seen that in the Sebastianus case. And there is a remarkably pronounced habit of concluding a word with a single note on the last syllable in all repertories. This confirms, in my opinion, Ewald Jammer's remarks about the exposed position of single words, which has to do also with tonality. This is from my part.
Good, thank you. Well, shall we move straight on to Niels Holger's response? And then Roman, yes, come here.